Hello and welcome to the first coaching review video. In this intro, I'll be discussing 5 leveling tips or more while reviewing this Leaguestart style ranger run from James. During the review, I'll be looking for zones or actions I believe they can improve on, and as we do so, we'll talk a little bit about their self-described strengths and weaknesses, areas they want to improve on, and anything else that pops up. If you're also looking to improve your Leaguestart and want a coaching review, then you can make a submission in the Discord if you're either a Twitch or Patreon subscriber. Right now, I'm offering campaign reviews, and if it's of interest, potentially Atlas and in-game in the future. Anyways, getting into it, the first question they had is the classic, what are the pros and cons of Lightning Arrow versus Rain of Arrows? I believe you can use either skill, and it's mostly personal preference. In the past, I might have said Rain of Arrows is faster, but after playing a ton of Lightning Arrow, I really do believe both are viable. Mainly because when I play LA, I tend to just get more XP and gear, which I find beneficial for mapping speedruns. The second question they had was Maniforged Arrows versus Ballista Totems. Bow builds have a lot of leveling options, and you can just use Maniforged Arrows, or just Totems, or both. In my recent runs, I've been buying a Shrapnel Ballista in Act 1 for 1 Wisdom, and afterwards, eventually dropping it later in maps. And related to this is Maniforged Frenzy versus Blood Rage. Blood Rage is a strong option if you can mitigate the damage over time aspect. However, I haven't been incorporating it yet, mostly due to socket pressure and alteration consistency. Furthermore, I also value frenzy charges on bosses more so than I do on trash during the campaign. The third question is, a Lyra or 2 skill points? They were told to always take 2 skill points because you can just get better gear. However, I would argue in a Leaguestart Rush context, this is a build dependent decision. If you're playing a Templar who has a lot of access to all resist on the tree, then sure, I'll agree 2 skill points is a totally justifiable choice. However, on bow rangers in particular, I strongly believe a Lyra is the way to go, because the 15 all resist will be your only source of passive tree resistance for a while, with nodes like One with Nature being allocated later. Some may then argue that nodes such as Weathered Hunter and Survivalist can also temporarily patch you up, which I would possibly agree with if it was an Act 5 speedrun. But because this character is moving onward to maps, I would argue Weathered Hunter and the Fire nodes in particular are out of the way and delay the crit swap, which is the second reason why I believe Lyra is the way to go, as most bow builds nowadays, in the process of scaling to 2 and 4 stone damage, complete the crit swap either in BA or shortly after. The third reason is, I believe 15% all resist, 20 crit multi, and 5 energen are great stats for both early and late game prog. And the fourth reason is, the less resist you need on gear, the more room you have for damage, which is especially relevant for bow builds, because rings, amulets, and quivers can provide a ton of damage, and potentially even more if you can craft flat damage on top. The fourth question they had, is it okay to take more defensive nodes while leveling? Since they are primarily doing softcore speedruns, I would encourage them to take less defensive nodes during the campaign process, especially in practice runs, so they can get more accustomed to playing with higher damage and speed. That being said, if runs are too hard, it's totally okay to tank up and get the defenses you need. The fifth question they had was not so much a question, but more looking for input on planning. What I can say here is, before any run, it's always a good idea to review links, socket colors, and which vendors are providing what gems. Or even conceptual things, such as, I'm trying to equip a short bow level 5, then I'm going to use the Dweller Essence on it. Afterwards, I'm going to keep an eye out for item level 11 bows or higher. Then in Act 2, I'll be looking at composite bows, and so on and so forth. And if some of these concepts are too hard to remember, having reminders on a second monitor, laptop, or even a notepad on your desk are all things I've done, still do, and can recommend. Now, James is definitely an above average player, because in this run, they completed Act Katava with all skill points and labs in 3 hours and 12 minutes. What was especially impressive is that they were also ready to go to maps after, then practice on Lightning Arrow fresh start mapping. Their self-described strengths were that their Act 1 is relatively strong, and they feel good at making a character that feels good to play, which is always important because making sure your character has the quality of life it needs for your playstyle should generally supersede theoretical power or path of building stat padding goals. For weaknesses, they believe they overkill too much, often overleveling quite a bit, because they feel the need to kill everything for safety reasons. And when they try to go fast, they often feel unsafe, especially when pushing for a PB, leading to a lot of deaths. There are 2 general learnings here to counteract this. The first being knowing rough XP breakpoints, know when you can focus primarily on forward progression, and the second being partly a movement or skill issue. It should be hard to point out, but something you'll have to keep in mind when watching. Areas they are looking to improve on are Acts 2 and 3, specifically in regards to planning and gearing. So in this review, we will be focusing on Acts 2 and 3, which makes sense because one of the first things I do is check the splits. In terms of potential improvement, what immediately sticks out to me is a possible time save of 4 to 5 minutes or more in Act 2, 4 to 5 minutes or more in Act 3, and 5 to 6 minutes or more in Act 4. So getting into the run, the first 2 things you have to note is in the ledge they used a Contempt Essence on this short bow, which will reduce bow pressure for the rest of Act 2, and potentially further depending on how many other sources of flat damage they find. And secondly, they are actually almost level 14 going into Act 2, which is very high. So they should be able to take advantage of this and mostly just run through zones for the next while. Entering Southern, they did a glove swap and then review their inventory for upgrades while moving, which is a really good skill to have. The next step here is to then make a plan for what's getting vendored and what's not. Because if you fast forward to town, this vendor just takes too long and could have been avoided. It's probably one of the most common errors anyone new to racing can make, which is not planning your vendors beforehand, not planning your town routing. Which we'll immediately see again after the Den quest, where after a longer than normal vendor, we walk to the waypoint, before remembering there's a free quicksilver in town waiting for us. Fast forwarding to Sins 1, since they're almost 15.5, skipping the guaranteed blue pack was definitely the correct decision, and then they correctly read the exit to Sins 2 with a waypoint tell. Shortly after, we see Einhar, which you generally should always click for almost zero cost improvement in XP gain. However, skipping him here is not the biggest deal, because he will spawn afterwards at the trial entrance. A little bit later, they completed the Sins 2 Blink Out trial skip, which is great to see. They mentioned they watched a ton of my VODs, they are doing some form of research and self-improvement, which is a great sign. On the walkway here, I'm going to point out quicksilver usage. Minor but impactful over the duration of a run. If you have 2 quicksilvers, you'd always try to have one up, especially on a running build. The vendor after is somewhat cleaner, with some small potential room for improvement. And then in the riverways, they do click Einar, which is great. But in this zone, I believe I found one of the reasons for their over XPing problems. Which is they are not taking advantage of Mirage Archer and are attacking a little bit too much for my liking. Generally in Acts 1 and 2, and a little bit of Act 3, if you're looking to get a really fast time, which they said they were, then you're looking to mostly attack every so often to keep Mirage Archer up and use your totems to fill in the gaps. The next thing I'd like to point out is the way forward. After defeating the guard captain, they log out and take the waypoint to Act 1, which is not the worst thing. The issue here is, they then go to complete the crypt trial and log out again. What I would have liked to see is them TPing out instead and spawning in Act 2 closer to the waypoint before continuing. This is a problem we'll see a couple more times in the run, for example Vol Oversoul, another opportunity to TP to town, but instead spawning in Act 1. Moving forward to Act 3, they can remove their chest here for 5% movement speed, and moving forward to the crematorium, a little bit more decisiveness and click accuracy on the waypoint here is desired. After the Catacombs trial, we have another unplanned vendor showing a little bit of hesitation, which is something I just have to keep emphasizing because this time really does add up over the course of a run. What's interesting here is they have 4-link evasion boots, which they decided to elk to potentially craft movement speed on. It had an open prefix, but since they only had one augment, they opted to chaos it instead, and were rewarded with 10 MS. I'm not sure if I would have chaosed it, as I'm generally trying to save rolling currency for bows, but it's not the worst thing. I also might have considered chroming it first, because if it didn't hit, I could save the chaos for later. Now since they got a 4-link, they went back to Act 2 at the Battlefront waypoint, which is fine, so you can take one gem for free from Silk and purchase the other. However, they did purchase the second elemental damage with attacks for their Ballista Totem, which if you ask me, is not a high priority. Moving on to docks, they got a short layout which is amazing, and they're already level 25.5, which is great XP, meaning they could leave the zone early. However, the issue is, since they just went back to Act 2, when they log out here, they spawn in Act 2. Instead, I would like to see them TP out. In Stellaris 2, when taking the Infernal Talc, they attempt to drag it to their inventory, but preemptively hit the clear screen button. Control clicking would have avoided this issue. Fast forwarding to post Lunaris 2 Piety, we have a very strange town sequence. After logging out, we spawn in the middle of town and go left, walking past Clarissa for the skill point. Afterwards, we walk back, vendoring at Clarissa, before going right, all the way to Maramoa for the Gravicious gem. Then, we walk back to Clarissa to purchase a gem, and then walk to the waypoint. This is a little bit too much for my liking. Again, just gotta plan the town sequencing and vendors better. The last thing to discuss is this Grovebo at the Dominus rooftop. Grovebo's have level 35 requirement, and James is only level 30 at this point, so it's worth considering waiting to level 34 before potentially crafting it, since they might drop a better rare bow normal base on the way beforehand. Overall, James is a very solid player, and with a bit more deliberate practice, I could definitely see a 3-hour campaign in their future. Anyways, that concludes the first coaching review video. If you found this helpful or educational in any way, please let me know. Thanks for watching, and as always, have a great day, Exiles. Bye.
You've just earned yourself some bigger prey, Huntress. Listen, it was